Chapter 3 of the Tale of Daddy Longlegs. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Lucy Burgoyne. The Tale of Daddy Longlegs by Arthur Scott Bailey. Chapter 3 Mr. Crow is Displeased. Daddy Longlegs had such pleasant manners that it was no time at all before his neighbors agreed that he was a good old soul, and everybody was glad to claim him as a friend. At least, everybody but Mr. Crow. Mr. Crow soon found that people were asking Daddy's advice on all sorts of questions, because they thought he was very old, and therefore very wise. And Mr. Crow at once became so jealous that he didn't know what to do. He began making unkind remarks about his new rival, saying that no matter how old a person might be, if he had a small head and 8 long legs, it was not reasonable to believe that he could have much of a brain. Whenever anybody mentioned Daddy's name, Mr. Crow would haw-haw loudly, and mutter something about old spindly legs. Mr. Crow had spent many summers in Pleasant Valley, and during that time he had advised thousands of his neighbors. Indeed, he often boasted that if he had a kernel of corn for every bit of advice he had given away, he never would have to wonder where he was going to get his next meal. When some friends of Mr. Crow's repeated that speech to Daddy Longlegs, he observed that Mr. Crow must be very wise. No doubt, he added in his thin, quavering voice, no doubt Mr. Crow's help would be worth a kernel of corn to anybody who was in trouble. If his advice was good, no one would object to paying for it, and if it proved to be bad, no one would miss a kernel of corn. It happened that Daddy Longlegs' comment soon reached the ears of old Mr. Crow, and it made that gentleman furious. "This is the first time anybody has suggested that my advice is not always first class," he croaked. "Here's this long-legged upstart interfering in my affairs. I must teach him a lesson," Mr. Crow declared. Well, that very afternoon he challenged Daddy Longlegs to a contest. "I intend to prove," said Mr. Crow, "that my advice is always good, and that yours is always bad." "Very well," Daddy Longlegs answered, "but I advise you to go home at once, Mr. Crow. You're very hoarse, and I'm sure you ought to be in bed." Now, the old gentleman was always hoarse, and since he disliked to have anyone mention his infirmity, his eyes snapped angrily. "I advise you," he roared, "I advise you to keep your advice to yourself." Of course that was a rude speech, but Daddy Longlegs did not take offense at it. He straightway told Mr. Crow that he ought to wear rubbers, and Mr. Crow was so enraged that he couldn't speak for as much as half an hour. It was understood that the contest between Daddy and Mr. Crow would take place the following morning, and when that time came a big crowd had gathered upon the stone wall to see the fun. End of chapter 3.